All right. So we've talked a little bit about solutions and different kinds of solutions and how everything we're doing is happening inside a system. In one of the earlier sessions, Antonio loosely defined a system as, a bunch of interrelated parts that are in dynamic relationship to each other. And those are exactly the two reasons that make system change work really difficult, right? Because the things are connected to each other and because the relationships are not fixed, they're dynamic. So they're constantly changing and moving, right? And so when we're trying to figure out how do I enact change in my community, this is a helpful framework. And I'm sure some of you have struggled with this, and I'm positive some of you are grappling with this right now as you do your CNAs. At which level do I enact solutions, right? People need things right now. We need the practical solutions. We need safe air. We need high quality education. We need food security, housing security. We need those things like yesterday, right? And we want to try to do work, change work at the structural level, right? That's about information, rules, power, policy work, right? We want to do that work. We know it takes more time and more effort. And then there is this really big lever, which is probably the hardest to implement. That's at this mindset level, right? When we talk about decolonizing, not as a metaphor, right? Not as a way to respond to our guilt about being settlers, right? But as a way to really incorporate, integrate, we have to start doing work at what Donella Meadows called a cultural lever. So this is also in your workbook, so don't worry about copying all of this. You have this in your workbook, and we'll also share the slides with you once the module is over. So I want to give you some concrete examples of solutions that might happen at each of the levers. So at the practical level, we're talking about concrete measurable changes, right? So metrics, materials, standards. So the land tax is a great example of affecting the flow of resources for the purpose of addressing exactly what we're talking about, settler colonialism, right? So this is one solution that starts to go beyond kind of the land acknowledgement, the verbal, to the material. The Highlander Center has changed the standard for how organizing happens. So that it's a school for organizers, more or less, and they have really changed for several generations now how organizings happen and almost like formalizing organizing as something you get trained up on, right, as a form of education. I know some of you are involved in energy poverty work, and also things like utility burden, right? So those are material things you can change. And the picture on the top right there is from last year's fires, right? Like, who is out there producing our food when all of us are told to stay at home, right? Who is still out there because labor rights are really poor for farm workers? So we have to start changing some of those practical things. And Martha, I think you've talked about translation being a really important part of your work, right? So those are examples of practical solutions. At the structural level, which takes more time, more effort, is harder to implement, but the leverage is greater if we're really talking about system change. So this is where, policy change work, right? Like designing policies comes into play. And we can't talk about meaningfully designing policy if the systems of engagement are broken, right? So what Corinne and Michelle shared about the spectrum of engagement is so important, because if policy designers are out of touch with what's happening on the grounds, they will design poor policies, right? They will design policies with blind sites, with bias, with racism built in. And if they scale, it also scales all of those mistakes. And I want to share this example. I don't know. I sent out this research. I don't know if anyone had a chance to look at it, but the two students here, Diego and Rosario, they're from SoCal. They're students, and they did this project that mapped warehouses. And it's a really cool example of how public-private, not public-private, but how a government agency and universities and frontline communities can set up a partnership that works. So they had a feeling from their lived experiences that warehouses were being placed disproportionately amongst low-income people of color neighborhoods. But they didn't know the location of their warehouses. Nobody knew. And so the partnership that happened was that the universities they were working with supported the students who were doing this project to request the locations of the warehouses, and the air quality management district put up the thousands of dollars it took to acquire those locations, and the students then mapped it and overlaid it with things like asthma rates, right, about income. And so they were able to produce this data visual story about the different layers of inequities that were taking place in their community. So that's an example of the way that access to information can start to change structures and systems. And there's a lot of work happening right now around just transitions and thinking about labor and like, what does green really mean, right? If things like job access, job quality, job security, if those things are not well considered. For cultural levers, we have to really rely on the arts. So I want to give a few examples here. So do you all remember in an earlier session, Michelle talked about, we were like doing the baseball game metaphor and we didn't really like it. And she said, a better example is actually about shoes, right? It's like different size feet, different needs, different size shoes. And so that is a really big mindset change, especially in certain institutions. Moving from equality to equity is a big jump. And some of our public agencies are still grappling with how to do that. But that's a big mindset level change. And I want to also give a shout out to Faye Love's organization. It's like really leaning on the arts to do this work. And of course, Octavia Butler's work really helping us grow our imagination, right, about what is even possible. And there's a podcast by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson called How to Save the Planet. And there's this one episode, I highly recommend it. It's talking about anthems and how music and an anthem is not some luxury, not like some byproduct of a movement, but how it's central to movement building. And so they really break down, the role that We Shall Overcome played in the civil rights movement and how we don't have something like that right now. We don't have a thing that keeps us going, that keeps us united when times get hard, when we face setbacks, right? When sometimes our bodies are literally on the line. So I just talked a whole lot. So I want to just give a couple minutes to read the chat and also respond a little bit before Kevin shares some concrete examples of how solutions can really be acting on all three levels. Great. I love it. All the different comments and resources. We're tracking all these resources that are getting shared somehow, right? I feel like every session someone shares something and I'm like, oh, we got to put that somewhere, maybe in the resource library. Cool. Yes, yes, Donald Glover's song. Nice, some book recommendations happening. Okay, cool. Nice. Yeah, the song we played feels like summer. Okay, cool. So keep the chat going and I'm going to hand it over to Kevin.
All right, thanks, EE. I'm going to share my screen again with some of these images to support some of this ideation. Some of the stuff I love the most is thinking about our strategy in solution development, and when we take a singular solution that's focused, maybe it's been directed by a certain source of funding, or a high priority idea in the community to meet a community need, and then asking ourselves the question, what can be added on? What could we integrate with this particular strategy such that it can meet as many needs as is reasonable, possible, or feasible with the one action? And so when we look at energy justice, addressing energy poverty with, say, solar photovoltaics, like a project like Light Up Navajo, the Navajo Nation, putting up solar panels as a way to have access to reliable electricity for families who have no access today, and not using fossil fuels, but doing it in a way that is resilient and in line with our kind of adaptation practices. But also doing it in a way that the ownership of the solar photovoltaics is actually owned by the community, so that we can actually build up community wealth and address social repair through the mechanism. So as electricity as a service, if there's a ratepayer mechanism, the payments for electricity access could actually, the benefits of that could accrue back to the community who's receiving the power. And so that the ownership of the assets themselves can stay with the community. So increasing community wealth, both immediately through assets and then over time. But then integrating the solar panels, we might ask ourselves, what can we do on the same land footprint where the solar photovoltaic panels are? Maybe we can grow, mixed organic vegetables, in and around the solar panel infrastructure, or maybe grazing with ruminants. So having more food security and food access. So integrating the land use activity with energy generation. But what about the labor for setting up, maintaining, and monitoring the systems that are developed, that are producing the energy or the food? That could be employment for the community youth, or job training, skills training. So the thinking, every time there's labor that's involved in some kind of contracting, it's like, oh, that's an opportunity for skill building in the community, maybe vocational pathways, or just employment in terms of where employment is otherwise fraught. And then, of course, increasing climate resilience. What's the use? What would we use the electricity for? Maybe the electricity, this project is for a cooling center for seniors in the community, or some other climate resilience or adaptation kind of project. And I think that the thought process here of taking these stacked solutions, and I'll go through another example, is where the funding for this kind of conglomeration or integrated development could have come in for the cooling center, or the funding could have come in for the green job development, or the funding could have come in for addressing energy poverty, or for energy justice, or the food funding could have come in for food security. But if we leverage any of the resources that are coming in for optimal benefit, we do this kind of stacking of functions. Similarly, in this other example, so much of the rematriation and land back movement using mechanisms like land trusts, providing for assets that could be utilized for meeting community needs, increasing sometimes the asset growing for wealth creation in a community, But then cite what are the uses that could be integrated with some of the recommon land or the land trust land. It could be for innovation or a green hub for training and learning, or learning about ethnobotany or conservation practices or traditional ecological knowledge and sharing. Similarly, the same kind of physical assets could be utilized for grid infrastructure. So we could layer on diversified renewable energy, wind and solar, provide schooling or an educational facility for youth skill building, and of course, intergenerational knowledge transfer as one of the outcomes. So every time we find ourselves with a particular solution, we can ask ourselves, what can be integrated here to meet multiple community needs through one activity? I hand it back to you.
Right. Okay, let's jump in. So one of the intended outcomes, really, of this process is for you to be able to walk away with an actionable and strategic game plan for the solution that you prioritize. So a couple of keywords here: actionable. We want to break that solution down into manageable, concrete steps, and then strategic. We want to be able to leverage all possible tools and avenues to achieve your intended outcomes. That also includes removing potential barriers and obstacles. So I'm going to run through an example to give this a little more flavor. So let's say you have an idea, you want to establish a community garden. That solution might grow as you stack some additional ideas. So maybe you want to use this to create a community space, organize some gardening or cooking classes. Maybe combine a community pantry in addition to the produce that the garden will be growing. Maybe you also are thinking about electrification and indoor air quality and want to organize some demonstrations for induction cooking technologies. So now you have this larger stacked solution. This is a big idea, big vision. It can generate a lot of excitement. It can be really inspiring. It can serve as your guiding compass, but trying to implement this big stack solution as a whole can be harder to, can be a bit more challenging to manage. So how do we then break that up into smaller components that are a bit more concrete and a bit more manageable? So you might think about identifying some phases. So for example, maybe you look at 4 phases, going from research to development and design, then construction, then implementation, and thinking about ongoing operations. From there, a little more manageable, but now we can break that down even further, right? So maybe for research, you want to engage your community, see what the general interest is, how folks want to get involved or stay involved. Maybe a committee forms out of that process. Maybe getting more input in terms of how folks want to use that as a community space. You can also look at various policies and procedures in your city or other resources that can provide some guidance, and you can start to map out some potential sites for the community garden itself. Looking into phase 2, what are some partnerships that could be developed with landowners, with potential sponsors? Maybe a local utility or an energy-focused organization for the induction technology demonstrations. Maybe partnering with food rescue groups for the community pantry. Also thinking about designing the site and laying out what that garden could look like, and then the structure of your programming as well. Construction stage, looking at equipment and supplies to prepare the land, to make sure you have the tools for your community garden, maybe some permitting and construction of any buildings if you wanted to have like a physical sheltered community space for classes or other purposes. And then from there, moving into implementation. How are you going to conduct outreach? How are you going to let folks know that this space is available? How are you going to, what is your programming going to look like? Who's going to be doing that? What's the schedule? And then thinking about ongoing operations so that this is a sustainable effort. So these can each also then be broken down into individual tasks, and focusing on the earlier phases, the earlier steps would be recommended because this is an iterative process. There are things that you'll likely learn from each phase that can set you up for success for future phases. I should also note solutions can be stacked later on as well. So maybe you really start with that core solution, that core idea of establishing a community garden, and then thinking about other programming later on. I will note that having that bigger picture in mind earlier on can be helpful, so that as you're going, you're creating inroads for that type of expansion. Last thing I'll note here is, this process can be followed for any type of solution, whether that's expanding in an existing initiative, creating an educational campaign, doesn't have to be a physical project. The number of phases will likely vary, like what those phases look like will also likely vary. And this is probably a process that that you're familiar with, that you might have experienced or led with your organization as you've implemented previous solutions. But the guidance that we offer in the toolkit hopefully will provide some more concrete steps and additional resources that you can tap into. So ultimately, the game plan, I should note, is, again, it's not an iterative process. It's very, very circular. You have kind of your vision in mind, and you're thinking through the action steps. You're going to refine that as you get going to meet the various goals that you set out. But again, some key things to consider is how do we make this more actionable? So the more specific you can get, the more actionable your solution can become. And then from there, more likely it could be implemented and then sustained. So, what are the key steps that need to be taken to achieve your vision? What is the most logical sequence of steps? And are there any steps that should be completed earlier on to pave the way for future steps? You also want to be strategic. So when I think about being strategic, I think about thinking big and then also thinking ahead. So thinking big, where your vision is constantly kind of serving as your guiding compass, and then also thinking ahead. What are the levers that you can tap? Thinking about longer term sustainability. What are the obstacles that you might anticipate earlier on, so you can identify those action steps to clear those obstacles. So for success factors, you might think about capacity building. Are there capacity building strategies that should be pursued first or in parallel as you're moving your solution forward? Thinking about your allies and partnerships. Who are your allies that can join you in bringing the solution to life? Are there any partnerships that can be developed to help clear some obstacles? Also thinking about community assets. How can you leverage and enhance existing assets to support your solution? So yeah, I'll stop here to see if there are any questions. And then from here, we'll move into the pair share.
So I'm going to be following up in talking about, just when we're doing collaborations, sometimes it can be really hard to just like name what's happening. Like inequity is essentially about power, right? It's like inequity exists because relationships and institutions were built and they were designed to produce an output that has disproportionate burdens and benefits. And so, every time we are having some sort of an interaction, there's power at play, and all of like the structural and all the different kinds of powers are happening all at once. So I wanted to just break down a little bit about just like this idea of power, and then also think about how we can articulate and evaluate power and trust, because they can be so hard to pin down, right? So I will share quickly, and then we'll do a little bit of follow-up in the learning groups too. So there are different types of power, and different people have different ways to talk about it. This is from the Right Use of Power Institute out in Colorado, where Michelle is, woo woo. And so I want to run through an example using me, in this moment. And so this is EE's power in this moment, different types of power. So that's a little picture of me as a little baby.
And so I have personal power, something I was born with, right? That's my birthright. And my connection to that sense of personal power depends on the day, depends on the hour, right? Sometimes I don't always feel connected to it, but it's always there. I have role power as a curriculum designer, experience designer, and a facilitator. I get to share baby pictures of me, right? Like I get to decide what we talk about and what we don't, right? And so that's great power. I get to interrupt people, right? Like there's power that comes in that. I have some status powers, and there are spaces where I don't have status power, right? Like as an immigrant, but I'm cis and hetero, and I'm also professional class, right? And so there are different ways that I'm up power or down power when I think about status. And of course, there's collective power just by being in this space together, you know, being a part of UPI, which is collectively owned, right? Like there are different ways that I have collective power in this space. And then there's also systemic power, you know, because of my role as a consultant, you know, I'm a part of different institutions that are making these really big decisions around funding and impact, and right. And so just having access to that, right, that some of which I've gained because I have degrees, and right, like I have the privilege of being a part of a class that can be a consultant who has access, right? And so I also carry some of that power. And in general, we can't really talk about the power that's happening in the interactions we're having if we don't ask the right questions, right? So if we start asking some of these kinds of questions, right, not just what's happening, but how is it decided and who's deciding it? What's the process, right? And some of you mentioned already, you know, espoused values of equity. You can see how integrous they are by looking at the budget, right? Like immediately you can see if there's alignment between what people are saying and what people are doing just by looking at the budget and what priorities there are. And I want to share a couple of tools for assessing power and trust, and also share how we can even do it quickly. So the phrase psychological safety was coined in the 60s by two people who are organizational psychologists. And then more recently, there's work that breaks it down into 4 different levels. And so these are the 4 levels. And I want to point out that if you look at innovation threshold, right, you have to be safe enough to not only contribute, but to challenge. And the problems that we're trying to tackle right now, climate change, right, and all the complexities that are interwoven with climate change require creative thinking, requires radical imagination, right? You know, inside like an urgent time framework, we have to be able to get to that radical imagination, and we're not going to have it if we don't have the spaces where we can feel safe to learn, safe to contribute, and safe to challenge what's happening, right? Like safe to question. And then the other framework is measuring trust. So trust is another one of those things that can be hard to talk about. And so this is Dr. Brené Brown's work on the anatomy of trust and how there are 7 distinct elements that are trackable, teachable. And so as we start to talk about, you know, interactions that are happening inside partnerships, you can actually break down what's not working and what's working. So we'll do a quick little exercise.